Hi, this is Frank, and welcome back to The Next Realignment. In this episode, we're going to be talking about the decline of America's third-party system during the Gilded Age. In this episode, we're going to be talking about America's Gilded Age, the era that runs from the end of Reconstruction in 1876 to just before the turn of the 20th century. And it's an era that for a lot of Americans holds great romance and fascination because it's really just a study of contrasts. Like on one side, it's an era of vast economic growth and new opportunity, of new technologies, of swelling cities, of new factories and amazing wealth. New empires being built by people like Rockefeller and Carnegie, and the stately houses, the dresses. It's an era that inspires films and movies because it captures a moment of America just on the cusp of becoming from a medium power all the way to a true global competitor and great power. And yet at the same time, it is a time of corruption where politicians were widely perceived to be in the pockets of these railroad corporations and banks, with time of political machines and political graft. It's a time where with the booms came also horrific busts and depressions that threw people into poverty. It's a time where while these factories were booming, you also saw other Americans being left behind, particularly all the family farmers that had been the backbone of the American economy for generations, and now they're playing by a set of rules that are no longer the rules. And they're looking as these new millionaires are being born, and they're just falling further behind. And it's a time with these factories, they also come with child labor and 14-hour work weeks and just abusive labor practices. It's an era of history that is both golden with the name of the Gilded Age, but also a time of great social and moral challenge and in times decline. And so much of this era is very much tied in to the story of American politics, and particularly the story of the third-party system. As the third-party system came in part and reached the end of its agenda, and the third-party system declined, allowing this new Gilded Age to flourish. So, Reconstruction. As you remember, Reconstruction ends in 1876. And with the end of Reconstruction, America reaches the end of the thing that had bound its parties together. The Democratic and Republican Party of that era, the third-party system era, that had come out of the Civil War, were parties built and designed to hold coalitions together to fight the great issue of that age, the great issues of slavery and the Civil War and the post-Civil War settlement. And now in 1876, for all intents and purposes, that debate is resolved. We still have a Republican Party built on the Union. We have a Democratic Party built on rebellion and the Confederacy and resistance to Republican rule. And rhetorically, that's what remains. And it will remain for really the next 2 decades. We'll still have parties that were built out of that great debate, the debate over slavery and the Civil War and the post-Civil War settlement. So, in practice, despite all the sound and fury of elections, America's political parties now stand for essentially nothing. I don't mean to say that there were no more political issues to fight because, there's still government. Issues have to get addressed. There's still officials that have to address those issues, and they do it with the parties as they exist. And the issues they fought about were sort of the ones that had been lingering around at the time still. They had to deal with tariffs, which were still controversial, with Northerners, with manufacturing economy wanting higher tariffs to protect industry, with agricultural economies, particularly in the South, resisting tariffs as just raising prices with no corresponding benefit. You now had a new issue of temperance that had arisen in the Second Great Awakening, and that became an issue in politics that people would fight about in elections. You also had issues from the economy, because it was a time of great growth, but also bust. It was boom and bust. And in each of these economic changes and crises, government had to deal with it, and politicians who were elected had to address each economic crisis as it came. But despite the fact that there were issues, there was no longer the major issue that held the parties together, that bound them, and that gave them a direction, that gave them an agenda and an ideology to pursue. Now, so in practice, with no real direction anymore, with nothing to keep Democrats and Republicans united, the political system and the parties went into an era of corruption and drift. Because the only thing that was left with the major issue now implicitly resolved, despite the rhetoric otherwise, the only thing that was left was careerism. What was left was the opportunity to use government to get a job or to get an advantage in your business, and to the team sport of politics, elections for the sake of elections. And in a political system where politics doesn't mean anything to anybody, when it's all just about getting a job and doing what's best for me and maybe a little bit sticking it to you, in a system like that, you're always going to see an increase in corruption and national drift. See, the Gilded Age is rightly considered probably the most corrupt era of American history, the time where politics was probably at its worst. Because America's political leaders, with nothing really to guide them, it was just all about self-interest and graft. You saw politicians themselves, a lot of times they were considered in the pockets of the rich. Many of them were increasingly on the payrolls of people of great wealth and companies. They were getting railroad passes and they were serving on corporate boards. And this was across the parties. Both Republicans and Democrats were widely perceived by the population as in the pockets of the great companies and in the pockets of wealth. In addition to that, you had the problem of a spoils system run amok. Going back to the Jacksonian era, politics had adopted the spoils system, this idea that if you worked for a party, that then you would eventually be able to potentially get a job in the party to bring the people into government. But now it had increasingly metastasized, and politics had become a system of interlocking, dueling political machines. And this was in both parties. In various places in the country, there'd be a boss now. He had a machine in place. He would take his cronies, who he could control, and that's who he would send to the Senate, and he could basically rule his little area like a dictator. And of course, these machines were often fueled by graft and corruption itself. And then on top of that, every time anyone would get elected, new officials got elected, there would be this flood of office seekers distracting them from doing anything. Because now people had an expectation that if you helped in the campaign, that you would be able to get a job. So anytime anyone got elected, there'd just be a flood of people seeking opportunities and jobs, distracting them from doing the job of government. It created what was probably the greatest political issue of the age, except it was an issue that wasn't fought between the parties, but across them. And that was good government and civil service reform. The biggest issue now became cleaning up this mess. And the parties would have factions of good government people that wanted to clean up the corruption, and then the party regulars who liked it as it was and didn't want to rock the boat. And this was particularly true of the Republican Party. Because remember, the Republican Party was built as a much more moralistic party. It was a party of reformers. It was a party that was built to fight the injustice of slavery. So there were a lot of Republicans who found this entire situation disgusting. And they would fight within the party, and they would usually lose to try to clean up the system. And sometimes, several times, they actually defected from the party for an election because they were so disgusted with the corruption around them. And they were the liberal Republicans in one election, in another they were called the half-breeds, and another they were the mugwumps. But each time, this faction of reformers were fighting for civil service reform to try to make government appointments based on merit and professionalize the civil service to get rid of all this job seeking and otherwise push for good government. So, overall, the parties were in an era of drift. Nothing was really being done. They didn't really have agendas. They were just ad hoc dealing with issues. At election time, they're fighting about the Civil War, a war that with each election is further in the past. And corruption is creeping up everywhere, the worst corruption of probably any era in American history. And on top of all that, there was another new problem. And that was the problem of a changing economy with industrialization. See, during the Civil War, America was still mostly an agricultural country, as it had been really since the founding. And since all those pioneers had gone west and built those family farms with all those little towns. And that was the backbone of America and its economic system. And now we had this new thing, industrialization, that was changing everything from underneath. So all those little towns, they were draining out. All the cities were booming, and we had new factories. We had railroads that were spreading everywhere. And these cities saw a flood of new immigrants. Immigrants looking for these new jobs in these new factories. Jobs that were often completely unregulated in the Wild West. So you had child labor, you had 14-hour work days, you had horrible work conditions and abuses. So this was all going on in the cities. And then back on the farms, you saw agricultural deflation as the economy had changed. And as prices were declining, you saw now the railroads sitting between the farms and their markets and being able to take a cut. And farms were going out of business, and it was getting harder and harder to make a living. The middle class, who were all these farmers that were looking around at the world and felt like that they were being cheated. And they felt quite reasonably, because they had done what their parents had done and what their grandparents had done. You take over the farm, you work hard, you play by the rules, and you're going to be okay. And they weren't okay because nobody told them the rules had changed. So while for some people are becoming new millionaires in the Gilded Age, and while the country on the whole is growing, this is a period that we consider one of great economic growth, although again of boom and bust. Growth and then depression, and then growth and then depression. But overall, America is growing, and it's becoming stronger and more wealthy and of stronger power. But while this is happening for a whole class of people, their world is falling apart. What do the parties have to say about this? Absolutely nothing. Because politics is still framed by the Civil War. When we have an election, it's still fighting the Civil War over and over again rhetorically. It's still about waving the bloody shirt over the war dead. And a Republican Party and a Democratic Party that were relitigating the war in election and after election. Nothing is getting done. Problems are being neglected. Nobody's dealing with the new big issue that has emerged that is changing America. The complete transformation of the United States by an economic revolution, the Industrial Revolution, that is changing absolutely everything. Every ingredient is now in place that has always caused a major realignment. You have the decline of the old issues. You saw the rise of corruption, the creation of new issues that the parties can't and really don't have the equipment to even think about, much less address. And all that's waiting for is a crisis, for a match to light the spark, and send the whole system crashing down. And then, in 1893, there was a depression called the Panic of 1893. It was the worst up to that point in American history, and it's still often considered the second worst, second only to the Great Depression. And with that, the third-party system was ready to come tumbling down. Thanks a lot for watching, and make sure you tune into the next episode, because we're going to be talking about the populist revolt that finally took down the third-party system and launched the populist and progressive era.